Let me suggest we get started, and apologies because we're a few minutes late, but this always happens in town, just until we can wait that everybody is settled in their places. But first of all, welcome to all of you here, but also to those that may be following us on through the webcast. Thank you for attending this invitation to look at what is, to many, the most important discussion on international cooperation this year worldwide, which is setting an agenda post-2015. And from our perspective, what we'd like to do is talk about the relevance for international trade policy and frameworks. So what we have been doing in the past few months, I'd say, and if not a year or two, is following very closely these debates, knowing that the locus of negotiations is between delegates in New York, but also a word of how many linkages there are from the negotiations and the discussions in New York with many other topics that are discussed in other places. Yesterday we were in an ICT-SD dialogue that looked at yet another topic of global economic governance, and someone asked, why do you repeatedly bring these topics to Geneva when they have other natural fora outside? And to me, what is simple as an answer there is that Geneva really gathers what should be the, if not the lead, the core of the trade policy making from all over the world. And so having the discussion in Geneva about those issues where trade could contribute, trade policy could contribute, or where those other discussions could contribute to the trade agendas, particularly the crafting of the frameworks, is always a critical concern to us. In the case of the post-2015 agenda, as I said before, many have written about it and said it in different fora at various levels of governance, including at top levels of governance, at the leadership level. That this is perhaps the most important discussion that is taking place, even for the next generation. So the definition of sustainable development goals, and then, also I think definition of how we move forward on the question of financing for development, decisions that are taken by governments with respect to international cooperation relative to climate change this year, and all of this compounded by and probably put into a same package, one package, as the post-2015 agenda on international cooperation for development, is probably going to determine how we go about that cooperation in the next 20 years or so. When the Millennium Development Goals were discussed and agreed in a very different process in New York back in the late 80s, nobody really thought what a long-term effect they would have, I think, as they were being discussed. Or very few people did. I don't know how many of you in the room were at those discussions. I had the chance of being around already at that time, and there was a lot of skepticism about the proposition of setting development goals. It is, I say late 90s, I'm sorry. Now it's 15 years later. They have obviously as a reference to development cooperation as a reference to policy making at the domestic level, and in many other ways, have had a great influence in the design of policies and probably in the fate of economies and the lives of many people. The proposition of the SDGs and the post-2015 agenda, with the lessons that we have learned in the past 15 years, and now through the very complex process that this has been going through, it's promising to be even more important as a reference for development, and probably would have or has the potential to have more of an impact. The SDGs that were already agreed through that complex process, this is the Sustainable Development Goals, as they are proposed, 17 of them with 169 targets, have been analyzed by many people. Some think they're too many, some think they're too complex to really follow in its execution and in terms of performance and achievement. Whatever it is, they have come as an ambition, a very ambitious program. They are an ambitious proposition. They do gather the very broad support from all over the world, stakeholders, so beyond governments. And now it is probably crucial at this point that ambition is matched in the discussions on financing for development, particularly, that will be defined by mid-year, just before the summer, and then again in the final form of the final outcome of the post-2015 agenda. Trade and investment, as they go in today's economy together, are an important component of these propositions on the SDGs themselves, but also in the documents that are being negotiated in the financing for development process. There is not only reference to trade policy in the way that we understand it today, so with a very broad conception of trade and investment policy and the frameworks themselves, but there's probably not necessarily a coherent vision that can be thread to again the references to that trade policy in those documents. This is not surprising, given that this is the result of compromises between negotiating parties with all these different interests, and particularly with very different situations, developmental situations, and then the all intricacies, vicissitudes of the negotiating processes in New York and in the UN setting. The hope that some of us that have been following, again, the relation between trade policy, the trade frameworks, and sustainable development objectives or sustainable development policy aspirations, is that whatever comes out is reflective of the 21st century economy, the 21st century global economy, the way in which production and trade are organized today, that it helps us move particularly, or that shift in many economies from primary commodity producers and what it's for many still a situation of export-led growth, and falling into traps of low income or low middle income or even high middle income growth traps, into more enabling situations for development, diversifying production, but also geared towards sustainable production and consumption as development models. For that, obviously, we need some of the references there, because that's what this would be, the post-2015 document. It would be a reference document. It would set targets for some governments with respect to development cooperation. But the agreements that really hardwired the functioning of the global economy today, they will be negotiated by trade policymakers. And those are the binding contractual arrangements that will really geared and define how these objectives are achieved. So there's a very important need for coherence. There's important need for coherence on the references to the trade and investment frameworks in those documents, but also to references on domestic policies that are, again, related to the functioning of national economies in the context of global markets. So it's about domestic policies as much as it is about the international trade and investment frameworks. Are the elements internally coherent and externally coherent with the realities of the trade system? Is anything missing? How could they be more ambitious? What are the implications of these multilateral or regional trade elements for domestic policy? There are some references to regional trade frameworks in the documents. Those are the questions that have really motivated us to organize this dialogue, which is also meant to be an information session. So what we will do is first start with two contextual presentations, one from Friedrich Soltau from the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs in New York. Friedrich is the person following this closely in New York, and he would speak to us particularly about the process towards September, where we are, what are the expectations, where are the discussions on and how they relate to trade. But we will also then ask my colleague Alice Tippin, who's been following this now for a couple of years, to present what we call a map of the trade elements across the proposed, both the proposed SDGs, as well as the Financing Zero draft, which is the draft going to Addis Ababa for the Financing for Development conference. We will then move to a panel of trade experts to just offer us their reactions to some of these issues. And we were having that panel Carsten Steinfeld from the WTO Secretariat, Marcus Bartley, previously with the Australian mission to the WTO, but now with the World Bank Group, Harshad Singh is also our colleague at ICTSD, and formerly with the WTO Secretariat as Deputy Director General there. And we have asked, and he has kindly accepted, Nicolas Imboden, the Executive Director of the Ideas Center, and someone who has more experience probably than all that is accumulated in the room that I can see on these topics, and particularly with specifically development financing and trade. So that's what we do in a first session. In the first session, we go through these two contextual presentations. Then in a second session, I'll just move to the audience and ask the panel to move up here and Nicola to take over and manage a debate and a dialogue on this. Then we'll go into questions and answer session. In between the two, do we have time for discussion? Yes. Yeah. Okay. So in the agenda, there will be time for discussion of the contextual presentation. So with that, let me just again welcome you all here and turn the floor then to Friedrich to start with his presentation. Friedrich, you get the floor.
Thank you very much, Ricardo, and good afternoon to all of you. I'm very glad to be here at the invitation of ICTSD. My mandate was to give you a view from New York of the negotiations. That's the view in New York, and we spent many hours in that room and other rooms working on the outcome of the Open Working Group, which in July last year came up with the proposal on SDGs that's been at the center of much debate, and also is going to be the centerpiece of the Post-2015 development agenda. Before I run on a little bit, just to see the mandate of that group, because it's very important to realize why we have what we have. Why do we have 17 goals? Why do we have the some of those targets, which I'll speak about a bit more in a moment? We have them because the mandate of this group. The group was mandated, this is only part of the mandate, in typical fashion it's rather long, but the first bullet point is rather important, although it seems quite anodyne, typical UN language, to balance all three dimensions. If we look back at the MDGs, of course, we find a major focus on the development, perhaps on the social side, but rather a neglect of the economic and dimension, certainly the environmental dimension. MDG 7 is the sort of vestige of what one consider an environmental agenda. So the SDGs set out from the beginning to cover in a balanced fashion all three dimensions, a much stronger focus on the economic side and also, of course, on the environment. Maybe that's something to bear in mind as we look at the set we have. Down to bullet 5 on the global nature and universally applicable. Again, the MDGs focused on the donor-recipient relationship within the traditional development paradigm, perhaps one could say. Certainly, the SDGs were meant to mark a break with that to a set of goals and targets applicable to all countries. Of course, not every target can be equally applicable to all countries. We have a differentiation in development status and national circumstances, but the idea being that we have universally applicable goals and targets, so bringing in essentially also under the umbrella the developed countries whose obligations under the MDGs were largely focused under MDG 8, the global partnership in the sense of being donors, but under this agenda they're also full participants in a broader set of goals and targets. Then, of course, also the next bullet, take into account different national realities. One of the critiques of the MDGs has been that they didn't take account of different starting points for countries. So setting global goals and forgetting that countries start at different points is a little unfair. That reflects in some part maybe a misunderstanding of the way the MDGs were meant to be interpreted, but still the sensitivity governments had to say, look, if we design a new agenda, we want to make quite sure that there are 193 of us, but we sit in very different positions at the start of the development and growth trajectories. So we need to take those into account in designing goals and targets. The last one focused on, on priority areas. Did we succeed in that? I don't know. We have 17 goals and targets. But one that's not here, but very, very important, is a break from a technocratic process which I think Ricardo alluded to, the development of the MDGs largely led within the UN system, but not in the hands of governments. In Rio Plus 20 in 2000, where this mandate came from, governments said, we want to be in the driving seat. This is going to be our agenda, not developed by technocrats, not developed by the UN system for us, but we are going to decide it. So that's a very important process, legitimacy difference that we see in the SDGs. So there are the 17 goals and the 169 targets, which I didn't put into one slide, but the 17 goals. Now, 1 to 6 is kind of the MDGs with a higher level of ambition. But from there, we go into other areas, which, as I've said, pick up the economic dimension. So many countries saying, if we looked at the MDGs, we're dealing with the symptoms, and I'm simplifying, but one critique again, dealing with the symptoms, but not addressing the causes of poverty. So, a goal 8 and 9, on growth, 9 dealing with infrastructure, countries arguing very strongly, we need infrastructure to be able to grow. We need roads, ports, ICT communication links. Those are important to us. Never mind only the other targets on social issues. Target 10, inequality. Very strong push on that. This kind of discourse we've had about leaving no one behind, that's been also popularized in books and so on about inequality. Greater concern that growth must be evenly spread, and even as we grow, some are being left behind. And speaking of trying to prune the number of goals, at some point in the political process, the co-chairs of the working group dropped goal 10. Well, there was a huge outcry. It made a comeback. So efforts were made to prune this agenda. And the fact is that there are strong constituencies behind every single one of these goals. Also, I want to just draw attention to goal 16. I think this is for me, one of the major innovations of this agenda, because again, one of the critiques of the MDGs was, yes, we captured the poverty dimension, but the Millennium Declaration, which is really the touchstone, the basis of the MDGs, the 2000 Declaration adopted by heads of state, deals a lot with peace, conflict, governance, rule of law issues, but these were not picked up in the MDGs. So there was a very, very strong push during the negotiations to introduce, on the one hand, the issue, the question into post-conflict, conflict resolution, the special situation of conflict countries, violence, rule of law, and this is was collapsed into one goal, goal 16. If you're a specialist in these areas, some of those targets are not the strongest you might look for, but the fact that we've taken what has never really been part of the Sustainable Development Agenda, always been at the level of the chapeau or the umbrella about, statements about the importance of inclusive societies, rule of law. That's always been there. You'll find that in the chapeau, introductory paragraphs of many sustainable development outcomes, but it's never been in the hard part, in the targets and goals. And here we find it there. So this is a real advance in the Sustainable Development Agenda. And a sort of a hook for a lot of work to be done, even if the targets for specialists might not be all that they wished for. Two other things I would say behind this agenda is very, very strong, this leave no one behind, which is kind of a slogan, but also points us to the fact that we can meet targets in aggregate. But the concern behind this agenda is either to be universal, end poverty, not reduce by 20% or leave 3%, but to end hunger. Under the health goal, very strong targets on ending the epidemics of HIV, AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria, so that we kind of get to the last person or the last case, and also deal in our approach with vulnerable groups, realizing that if we tackle certain targets, we have to pay special attention to vulnerable groups, because it's easy getting the easy wins. If it's poverty perhaps in an urban setting, what about poverty in rural areas? Or that kind of analysis needs to be put behind our approach to the goals and targets. And something which I also need to stress, of course, is some of these targets might be a little ambitious, perhaps over-ambitious, but the agenda is specifically meant to be an aspirational agenda. So these are not meant to be hardwired in the nature of international law, the way we negotiate provisions of international law. They're aspirational. That also means they're not binding in the sense that, in a legally binding sense, but of course they are very strong political aspirations and should be the launching pad to inspire action, not only in countries at the country level, but also I would say within other regimes, that are consistent or that are supportive of sustainable development, including the trade regime. Can find things here that are, if not explicitly trade provisions, are provisions that depend very much on action in the trade regime, such as on health. There's a strong commitment to dealing with non-communicable diseases, such as diabetes. These are diseases which require a lot of interventions with expensive medicines. That opens up, of course, new areas of perhaps of contention, but also of action to make sure that people in developing countries, which have a triple burden of disease, poverty, of course, the old scourges such as tuberculosis are alive and well there, but also a very fast rise in the diseases of lifestyle, such as diabetes. So, we need a lot of action there, cancer and so on. Last thing I want to mention, many of you probably would have seen, or I hope some of you have seen, The Economist article, which talks about unsustainable goals and asks not for 17 goals, but for 10 commandments. I think a good article to read, to be challenged. I think the main problem there is that when we think about these, we should take the lens of the MDGs away, and put on the lens of the development and sustainable development specifically. If you can do sustainable development in 10 goals or 6 goals, hats off to you. I don't think that's possible. So we have to really see that what we're doing here, we're putting 3 things together, not just development, but also the economic drivers of development, economic dimensions, infrastructure, and so on, and a very, very strong focus, of course, on the environment, and those are reflected in these goals. We have a goal on oceans and on biodiversity. So maybe that's incoherent, maybe that's impossible. You can have your views about that, but we have to step away and see we're not trying to replicate the MDGs. It's not MDGs 2.0 or MDGs Redux. So I know that Alice will say more about trade and trade in this agenda, but I want to say a few short things. Trade is considered traditionally within the sustainable development discourse as part of the means of implementation, and the other parts, they are finance, technology transfer, and capacity building. But trade is sort of being seen as supportive, or one of the engines for reaching the substantive commitments under the sustainable development agenda here. And the SDGs and the targets under them do contain a number of targets which are quite specific on trade, and others which are more generally referencing trade provisions. And some examples are on subsidies, aid for trade, and so on. But I think Alice will deal with those in greater detail. In the negotiations under the working group, over and over again, this tension that although there's a recognition that trade is important, there's a reluctance to delve too deeply into trade topics, recognizing that this is a very technical area of work which is under the umbrella here in Geneva of the WTO. It's often a case of, well, we want to do with this, but we have to be very careful. You know, let's leave this to the specialists, and this is not something which we want to advance on too much. So that leaves, and if that's the case, the question really is, can we foster a organizing or supportive environment that supports sustainable development without substituting in New York the work at the technical level on trade rules? So what is the sort of the movement from a technical discourse which will be taking place here to a supportive, enabling environment? And I think that's really a question. The question is, has that succeeded? Has enough been done in that respect within the context of the working group and also within the context of the financing for development outcome? If there is this balance, has enough ambition or enough work and thought gone into doing that? And maybe that's something we can hear about as we talk. Since after all the process, let me give you a quick overview of where we are going. I've kind of given you a sense of where we've come from. So having finished the work of the Open Working Group, we now switch to yet another acronym-ridden process, the negotiations on the Post-2015 development agenda. And they began in January with a sort of stock taking. We then had a meeting in February on the declaration. So the parts in red, they give you the main elements of what will be the post-2015 development agenda. You know, what is this going to consist of? It's going to consist of a declaration, so an overarching political statement that will supposedly be concise, it'll be transformative, it'll sketch out where we're going, you know. The agenda will contain, of course, probably at its center or its core, the goals and targets, and then very importantly, the means of implementation and the global partnership, you know. So the means of implementation are really the financing and so on, and the partnership is some sort of sense of the renewal of MDG 8, but probably also having more recognition that the world has changed, that there's a greater role for the private sector, that we need to mobilize new forms of partnerships around some of these goals. So things like Gavi, the Vaccines Initiative, and other partnerships that that are neither purely private nor purely public, but that have some sort of supportive function in achieving the goals and targets. And then lastly, very important, in May we're going to talk about the follow-up and review. This is essentially the framework for accountability and monitoring. That's an institutional discussion about which institutions within the UN are going to review this agenda, how will it be broken up among these institutions, how often perhaps, but really the parameters of the review. And hidden there too is also the role of the UN system. Will the UN system come and report? To whom will it report on its progress? Some of those elements will be under that discussion as well. But very important, of course, because we need to measure and follow up on progress we've made. And then leaving essentially some time to put all of this together and the sort of hardcore negotiations through June and July. And in September, the summit will adopt the agenda in its final form. Now, before we get to as you'll see here, the Addis conference takes place in the second week of July. So that means one big part of the final agenda, the means of implementation really, wrong slide, the means of implementation will be dealt with in Addis. So even as we're working through some of the preliminary things, the discussion on goals and targets which we've had, looking at looking at the declaration which has been done. Looming in the background is a discussion around the means, the money and the framework around the money, the framework around perhaps also some trade elements. That will take place quite late in the day. So if that's a positive outcome, the question is, how do we take that and how is that inserted into the agenda that will be finalized in the later July? So a very short, compressed time frame to deal with a lot of big issues. And one idea that was floated last week during the post-2015 meeting was that there would be a sort of an Addis light, that assuming there's a good positive outcome in Addis, that outcome would somehow be compressed, or a sort of a highlight reel of that outcome would become part of the post-2015 agenda. Because of course, if we have this element there, can we just reference it? Is it enough to say we welcome it? Probably not. We have to take, in some way, the substance and in a balanced fashion, make that part of the total agenda in the end. But that's not settled yet. That's just sort of some feedback from initial feedback. So the relationship between these two needs to be worked out, and that's a large political job that negotiators have to obviously focus their mind on. And they will be doing some of that work in April to sort of think about what are the common elements, what are the core elements which we can draw together into the post-2015 agenda. And then finalizing everything, as I said, will be a sort of a very big negotiation in July, putting in the review process, which not much is thought it's gone into, but not much, we haven't seen much of it worked out. Which kind of institutions will do the follow-up process, the involvement of the UN system. What do we do with outside parties that come into the agenda under the global partnership? How do we hold them accountable? Can they report their progress? If the private sector is a major actor, how can we encourage sort of review, measurement, that they can also be part of it? Because the private sector is very bent on measurement. They take measurement seriously. The UN review and follow-up can be seen in a more political light, but for the private sector, the commitments that are made are often made in a very hardened way, which needs to be reported on and monitored very rigorously if such commitments are made. And then, of course, implementation. In January 2016, the big task begins. And as I close, one thing I should have mentioned earlier is we've had some discussion around indicators too. The targets are there, but if you have new targets, you also have new indicators. And of course, your progress can only be as good as the indicators you use to measure it. And because some of the targets we have are rather in new areas, there was more concern among delegations about the indicator process. So it's no longer just a purely technical process. We've seen the post-2015 group desire some what they call political guidance and oversight of the indicator development process. So the indicators will be developed by the Statistical Commission of the United Nations. It's a technical body that is headed by chief statisticians of the member states. And they have an initial draft set of indicators, indicative indicators, some 300 of them, which were circulated to statistical officers for their comment. They were reviewed by about 60 stats officers, and that report was shared with the negotiating group. And they will continue that work. And in 2016, in March only, the Stats Commission will endorse a final report containing the indicators for the agenda. But member states are going to have an oversight role of the indicator development, which is technical, but because some new areas are being touched on, it has a political dimension which is going to be addressed. So I think with that, I will leave it.
Thank you very much, Fredrik. That's a very good tour d'horizon of where the processes are right now, as well as thanks also for your substantive insights and your sort of you have planted some queries there that coincide with many that we have as well. So Alice, as I said before, is the Senior Program Officer at ICTSD, who is responsible for following up this process. She's been writing about it as well, so you can find some of her views on the relation between the SDGs and the post-2015 processes and the trade system in our website and our publications. Alice?
Thank you very much indeed, Ricardo. I thought what might be useful at this point in this dialogue is if I essentially sort of set the context of the substance. We know a little bit more now about the process, and I thought what might be helpful before we go into the panel discussion is essentially to map out for you where some of the key trade-related elements are in both the SDGs and now the Financing for Development discussion. So it's a mapping exercise. So the content of the post-2015 agenda, we think, will be made up of a number of different pillars. There'll be a broad declaration which provides the narrative for the next 15-year agenda. The Sustainable Development Goals, all 17 of them, and their 169 targets, will essentially be the what of the agenda. What are countries meant to be achieving? The means of implementation that Friedrich was discussing for the goals and targets in the Sustainable Development Goals and Targets will come both from within the Sustainable Development Goals and from the outcome document of the third Financing for Development conference in Addis. As Friedrich was saying, we're not completely sure yet, or it's not completely clear how the means of implementation in the goals and how the means of implementation elements in the financing document are going to eventually come together. There will be a system still being defined that will review progress towards the goals, and there will be a set of indicators which will be used to provide the basis for this measurement. And again, I think member states in New York are still working through exactly how that review process might work and what the indicators might look like. As Kirsten was saying, trade is considered broadly in the narrative a means of implementation issue. So when we look at all of these various pillars, at least at a conceptual level before we move to indicators, it's the interaction between the Sustainable Development Goals and the Financing for Development outcome document that's probably of the most direct interest. Now, so far, the discussions on the Sustainable Development Goals and the Financing for Development are only now beginning to be merged with this joint session towards the end of April. The discussions on means of implementation haven't been easy in New York. Delegations, I think, are grappling with a number of different questions. One relates precisely to this question of the location of the discussions. Should the means of implementation for this agenda be discussed in both the SDGs track and the Financing for Development track, or in a combined track? Or should they be discussed only in one track or the other, either the post-2015 agenda itself or the Financing for Development side? And the second question is one that I think Ricardo also alluded to. The second question concerns sequencing. The financing decision will be taken in Addis in mid-July. The SDGs and their targets are, we think, bar some technical proofing and perhaps technical amendments, more or less final, but they'll only be finally adopted in September, after the Financing for Development outcome. My sense, at least from speaking to people in New York, is that there is a real desire to have the Financing for Development outcome match the ambition of the SDGs in order to ensure that both elements remain intact and that the post-2015 agenda can be adopted as a whole in September. So if we look in a bit more detail at what's in the Sustainable Development Goals that's related to trade. So this diagram essentially helps to identify what some of the key trade-related targets are under each of the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, the relevant language on the Sustainable Development Goals is also collected in a handout that you have in your participant folder, so that may also help to decode some of the acronyms in this slide. So there are several trade-related targets that are identified as means of implementation or support measures for specific Sustainable Development Goals. Some of these make a very direct reference to trade. So under Goal 2 on ending hunger, there's a reference to in a target to the reform of distortions in agricultural markets, including export subsidies pursuant to the relevant WTO mandates. Increased support for aid for trade is one of only 2 means of implementation targets under Goal 8 on sustainable economic growth and employment. The reform of other perverse subsidies, like subsidies to fishing, with reference to the WTO negotiations, is listed under Goal 14. So some of these targets make very specific trade references. Others, which I've included, are indirectly related to trade. So you see a number of targets that refer to support for access to relevant technologies under the goals on water and sanitation, Goal 6, access to sustainable energy, Goal 7, or infrastructure, Goal 9. And finally, there are several directly trade-related targets listed under Goal 17, the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development. And these are considered cross-cutting means of implementation. So they're support measures that would support the achievement not only of a specific goal, but of the entire framework of goals. And some of these targets refer to strengthening the multilateral trading system under the WTO, completing the Doha Development Agenda negotiations, increasing exports from developing countries, improving duty-free and quota-free market access for developing countries, including through simplified rules of origin for exports from least developed countries. So there's a whole range of direct and indirect, specific and more general trade-related means of implementation just in the Sustainable Development Goals. So the other side of the discussion, of course, is what's going on in the financing for development. And what we have at the moment, released on the 16th of March, is a zero draft of what the Addis outcome document might look like. So this slide that you have here highlights what some of the key trade-related elements are in this other key source of means of implementation. So the zero draft for the Addis outcome builds on the outcomes of the two previous Financing for Development conferences in Monterey and Doha. The document itself identifies in different sections 7 core sources of finance, and you'll see them in the boxes across the top. So domestic public finance, private domestic and international finance, foreign direct investment, public international finance, which I put up there as ODA, or overseas development assistance, international trade is one of the elements, debt and debt sustainability, systemic issues, a lot of which refer to financial markets, and technology innovation and capacity building. So those are the 7 core sources of finance identified in the document. And within that, of course, we're particularly interested in the international trade elements. And I think there are several things that are interesting about the trade section of the zero draft. It starts by providing what I think is a complementary narrative to some of the trade targets in the SDGs. So it draws on Rio +20 language in explaining the benefits of a universal, rules-based, open, non-discriminatory and equitable multilateral trading system. But it also talks about the importance of flanking policies. And it talks about the fact that with appropriate supporting policies, trade can also promote decent work, combat inequality, and contribute to the realization of the SDGs. So there's an interesting kind of complementary narrative element. Most of the SDGs trade references refer, or at least seem to my reading to have in mind, multilateral rulemaking. What's interesting about the zero draft is that it explicitly refers to trade's contribution to sustainable development at the multilateral, but also at the regional and the domestic policy levels. So at the multilateral level, the draft repeats many of the SDG targets' references to the multilateral trading system, but it also reflects a number of relevant decisions taken at the WTO. It also refers explicitly, which I think is quite interesting, to the concept of regional integration and regional trade agreements and regional investment agreements. It refers, albeit briefly, to the importance of domestic flanking measures to ensure that trade contributes to sustainable development outcomes. But I think this is all very interesting, but I think what's most interesting is when you read across the two documents together. And I appreciate this is an exceptionally complicated slide, which is why it's also in the handouts that you have in your participant folders, and I'll make sure it's on the website as well. So putting both of these means of implementation pillars together and trying to read across them, so to speak, to build a bit of a map of the trade-related elements, here is what I see. So I'll follow the FfD draft's coverage of the multilateral, regional and domestic policies, and I'll focus a bit on where the financing draft expands, or at least does something a bit different from what's in the Sustainable Development Goal targets. Now, in this diagram, there are areas where the financing draft repeats or overlaps with the targets that are in the SDGs, and those are in the red boxes, and there are elements where it adds slightly to what's in the SDGs, and those are in the green boxes. So to start then with the multilateral trade system references. So the zero draft reiterates many of the multilateral trade targets, but it adds references to some relevant WTO decisions, and Karsten will talk about these in a bit more detail later. So the financing draft underlines the SDG target on strengthening the multilateral trading system, but adds references to meaningful trade liberalisation and the issue of fragmentation caused by regional trade agreements. So it's a sort of a two-sided reference to strengthening the multilateral trading system. The financing draft underlines the target in Goal 10 about implementing special and differential treatment in the WTO, but adds a reference to the monitoring mechanism agreed in Bali. I'll go through these in case it's useful. The Zero draft reiterates the commitments in SDG Target 2 to correcting and preventing restrictions in global agricultural markets, and adds in a reference to fishery markets. Perhaps, and I can only speculate because the draft doesn't make a separate reference to fisheries subsidies reform, which was one of the elements of the SDGs. It references the importance of TRIPS, flexibilities, including for public health, and goes a little bit beyond what's in the SDG target by adding a reference to responses to climate change as well. But the Zero draft fills a particularly important gap, I think, left by the SDGs by bringing back in the concept of trade facilitation. So it calls for WTO members to ratify the Bali Trade Facilitation Agreement, and complements this reference to soft trade infrastructure with a reference to multilateral development bank support for hard trade infrastructure. In terms of LDC issues, the draft reiterates SDG Target 1712 on duty-free, quota-free market access, adding a reference to the relevant Bali decision, and references to simpler rules of origin. Again, it repeats the SDG target, or references the SDG targets on aid for trade, especially for LDCs, but perhaps in addition to the SDG target, welcomes cooperation between developing countries in this area. Moving on to the regional integration and the regional trade agreements elements. So the FfD draft expands on the scope of the trade elements in the SDGs, but I think there are a couple of sort of underlying tensions in what the Financing for Development document says. And the first is this reference to the fragmentation of trade rules. So the Zero draft includes commitments both to strengthen regional integration and regional trade agreements, and to strengthen the multilateral trade system, and to work towards reducing fragmentation caused by international trade and investment agreements. The second tension, I think, relates to balancing the benefits of meaningful trade liberalisation and trade rules with the right to regulate for other policy objectives. The Zero draft suggests that a focus on transparent negotiation and implementation of regional trade agreements would help to not constrain policy making that would address inequality, environment, and sustainable development objectives. And the third and last level is the concept of domestic policies. So the draft calls on countries to implement sound domestic policies and reforms conducive to realising the potential of trade for sustainable development. This, I think, is a crucial addition which helps to underscore the importance of domestic policies and harnessing the benefits for trade. And there are even some suggestions, I think, in the domestic public finance element of the draft about what some of these policies could be it the reform of fossil fuel subsidies or transparent public procurement that supports sustainable development. And I think the questions that are probably left, even in an analysis and a mapping of what's there, the questions that we're left with are those that Ricardo spoke about in his introductory comments. Is this what we have here really coherent with the realities of the trade system now, and with the realities of what we think the trade system might look like or how it might develop in the next 15 years? What about its internal coherence with the rest of the SDG targets? Is the FfD document in the draft as it stands ambitious enough to match the ambition of the 169 targets in the SDGs? Is there enough support, or would this garner enough support amongst member states to make them all feel comfortable adopting the SDGs and the targets as they stand? Now, the next panel is going to look in a bit more detail on specific aspects of this agenda. But my own sense is that while the draft reflects very well where we are now, what WTO members agreed in Bali in December 2013, for example, I'm not sure it says very much about where we want to be in 2030 or practically how we might get there. And I think one of the questions that hopefully we can get into in the discussion that comes next is there anything missing? Are there things that really should be in this agenda that aren't? Or is it simply a question of explaining, perhaps at another level of detail, how these key elements could support implementation of the SDGs? I'll stop with that. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Alice. Okay, so you have two rather comprehensive presentations on the process on the post-2015, and as well as an analysis of what it's already contained there in the current documents as they are. Let me just open the floor and suggest we have some 20 minutes to listen to your comments or questions. So when you take the floor, just please identify yourself and given constraints of time, be as brief as you can. Yes, in the back, please.
Yeah, I'm Dunja Krause from UNRIS, the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development here in Geneva. I have a relatively general question, and first of all, thank you for these comprehensive overviews. I think they give a very good picture of the complexity of this challenge that we're all facing, where we have to deal not only with different pillars of sustainability, but different levels of implementation, different actors that are involved. And I was wondering, if we look at these different goals, and trade already being so complex is just one of them, how do we actually deal with goal conflicts? You've mentioned that some of the trade agreements, for example, they might actually be in conflict with some of the other sustainable development goals, or there are not very clear mechanisms of how we pursue this agenda. So my question is really, how do we get to a point where we can actually negotiate what should be kind of the priority order in case there are conflicts or trade-offs that we cannot avoid? Thank you.
Thank you. That's an excellent question, and let me suggest that we don't expect that Frederick or Alice would have responses to these very, very complex questions in themselves and challenging, but rather that the audience feels that questions you could feel free to contribute to comment or respond in the questions that are asked by other people in the room. So I have Raf here, please.
Thank you both. That was excellent. And in spite of its complexity, I think this simplifies them for us, your chart. Thank you, Alice. It's fantastic. Friedrich mentioned that unlike the MDG process, which was UN-driven, seen as technocratic, that the SDG process was quite different and therefore government-driven. But government-driven isn't the end of the story because, as Alice has pointed to the FfD, it's the private sector that wants to measure, that will insist on indicators, that will be called upon to bring the major portion of the funds for implementing these goals. And so a question to both of you really is, to what degree is the private sector built in to the SDGs? If you say it, I mean, the OWG process was meant to include civil society and academia and private sector, but I suppose, is it now really a government-driven? And then the outstanding question of who tells the private sector, other than through enabling environments, where to invest their money? How is it going to be different from business before?
Okay. Thank you, Raf. Any other? Yes, please.
Hello, I'm Alfita. I'm from the SPS committee of the WTO. So thank you for a very good explanation of how trade related to this. But I have an opinion about the inclusion of the special and differential treatment in this slide is not that appropriate, according to my very limited knowledge, of course, because from legal perspective, the special and differential treatment basically has no theme. It's basically just help the members feel happy. The developing countries feels happy about that because they are given, sorts of, okay, we care about you, but then the developed country doesn't really need to do anything, and it has never been brought to dispute. And because everybody hasn't said anything about that, then the gap is big. But on the other hand, I see that WTO contribute to this goal in the terms of the work of its committee. I'm from the SPS committee, so we know we have technical assistants that help a lot of developing countries understand their obligations and to engage more in trade, developing their standards and stuff. But I think the spatial and differential treatment itself doesn't really add that much to the goals that we are talking about. Thanks.
Okay. I'm a bit confused by your comment. So what you're saying is that the calling for a strengthening SDG, as it's really what it's in the goals, doesn't add much to the goals. That's it.
So basically, like, or there. So we have SDGs in every agreements of WTO. But again, it doesn't really mean anything. It's just for the conclusion of the agenda. So putting it there, not necessarily appropriate, in my opinion. If you put the works of the committee itself, the work of the secretariat itself, then it basically helps the linkage. But the SDT itself is not.
Thank you. Anybody else on any of these questions? Yes, please, and then Dr. Karachi.
Thanks for this great and timely event. I'm Shandor Sarkowski from the EU mission to the WTO. 3 quick points where I would like to seek your views, how thinking is evolving in the UN context. One, from the EU perspective, given the complexity and the necessity for expertise, we fully recognize the primacy of WTO with regard to trade issues at global level, and I think this is a very important point if you want to be efficient. The second point I want to make is that, and that was evoked by the speakers, that each country has a primary responsibility in our view for realizing the potential for trade. So indeed, the ownership, good governance, and sound domestic policies are essential. And the third point is that unilateral preferences continue to matter. And we think that from this perspective, all developed countries, but also upper middle income countries and emerging economies, they have their share to contribute to this, among others, through providing duty-free and quota-free access to their market for LDC products. So I wonder what is your take on these points. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Karachi.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and first of all, I wish to thank the panelists and those who, especially to Mr. Fridge, Salto, and Alice, and Ricardo as well. We were there yesterday as well in one of those G20. I wish to. It's some excellent presentation, but it's really hard to comprehend at the first instance that how to go forward. But a few preliminary comments. While Alice mentioned about domestic regulations, which perhaps were one of the reasons for how to make them more compatible with the international environment and to find a way forward in trying to implement the agenda, because different countries were at different levels. Yes, it is indeed a challenge and a daunting challenge indeed. But at the WTO, where we see currently is that one of the WTO's negotiating arm is almost limping at the moment. So they are not really coming forward with what they are supposed to do. And that is because some of the areas have really not been addressed. For example, the services part, which of course accounts for whatever, whether you talk of social dimensions or economic dimensions or development dimensions, all of them have a services part which has to be factored in. So that could be one reason of assessing and trying to address things from that particular perspective. Yes, I agree that there is now a concern on the spaghetti ball phenomenon of so many different RTAs, PTAs and other things emerging. And yesterday we heard a very novel, another concept of rules diversion and rules creation instead of trade creation and trade diversion, but it's really worth mentioning it. So how do you really, coming to the question exactly now after this, how do you really see that what needs to be specifically factored in terms of priority? Let's prioritize the things, because that's the most important thing. Out of this platter, what are the things that are doable and which could be really addressed and bring something to show it?